Hey everyone, it's Christina Wallace. I'm here with another Human Anatomy and Physiology 2 lab from Clackamas Community College, where today we're going to talk about exercise 31, electrocardiograms. So here we have a pretty standard looking electrocardiogram. And what an electrocardiogram is measuring is the electrical activity that is happening in the heart as signals are passed through the heart tissue to tell the muscle to contract. And so all of these peaks and valleys and bumps and stuff don't really tell you anything about what's physically happening. There's no measure of contraction. It doesn't matter how hard your heart contracts or anything. That's not what is getting picked up in the EKG. It's only electrical activity. So the first little bump on this graph we're going to talk about is the P wave. So I've highlighted all the P waves in this graph with my pink pen. And what a P wave measures is atrial depolarization. So that little bump is telling us what's electrically happening in our atria. Here's all the P waves. The next structure that occurs right after the P wave is the QRS complex, or the QRS wave. And what the QRS wave measures, the main thing it measures, is ventricular depolarization. And here are all the QRS complexes labeled on this EKG. The next structure that we see on the EKG is the T wave. And so I've highlighted all the T waves in green. And what the T wave measures is ventricular repolarization. So here are all the T waves labeled. And here's our graph labeled with all the waves. P, first bump, then QRS, the big spiky thing. T wave follows QRS. All right, so the first part, or first page of your lab report has you fill out a chart where you kind of talk about the electrical activity of the heart versus what's happening physically in the heart. So electrical activity is always going to involve words like depolarization and repolarization, and it's going to have something to do with a path from nodes to branches, to cells. That's all going to be electrical activity talk. Now, when we talk about the physical activity in the heart, basically, depolarization is always going to lead to some sort of muscle contraction. And then repolarization is going to follow muscle contraction. And then there's going to be a temporary moment of relaxation before we start the depolarization cycle all over again. So here are the specifics about what's happening electrically in the heart. First off, we're going to start up here in the right atrium with the SA node. Whoops, sorry. The SA node, the sinoatrial node. And that's where all of our depolarization is going to start. From that node, we're going to spread over to the left atrium, depolarizing, and then we're going to depolarize all of the right atrium. So that's all of this step right here. And then eventually we're going to get to this node, which is the AV node, the atrioventricular node. That's this step. So we're kind of working in the base of the heart, at the base of the heart with the first few steps. The next thing we're going to do is that signal is going to go from this AV node down the interventricular septum, down the bundle branches. And then we're going to reach the apex of the heart, so apex down here, and then we're going to start going into all these little fibers, the Purkinje fibers. Purkinje is some dead white guy. I'm sure there's a more anatomical name. That's going into Purkinje fibers, and then the next step is into the cardiac muscle cells. We're sending the electrical signal into the myocardium itself to tell those muscle cells to contract. And then after we do that, repolarization is going to follow. And so if you have depolarization kind of going up this direction, we're going to have repolarization kind of following it. And then in the middle, we're going to have muscle contraction. So this is depolarization there, this is muscle contraction happening here, and this is repolarization following it up. So cells pretty much do this cycle. They depolarize, then the muscle cells contract, then they repolarize, and then there's a little waiting period of rest. And then we just start the depolarize, contract, repolarize cycle all over again. So on your lab report, that's what the first page is really trying to get at. What happens every time I forget to turn on my pen. What happens electrically in the heart? I really wanted that to be blue to keep consistent. So what happens electrically in the heart? And then what happens physically in the heart. And so we talked about that. The P wave, the first thing that we do is depolarize the atria, and then this is the path of the signal. And then this is what's happening physically to the heart. And so I've done this one for you. And then duration in seconds. Oftentimes there will be a range given in your book, and then there's an average value. And so if you see two values here, the bottom one that's singular is always just going to be the average value. And so the next thing they want to ask you about is the QRS wave. And so remember, that's the big pointy thing. And so the QRS complex is where ventricular depolarization happens, and this is pretty much the pathway of that signal, and this is what's happening physically in the heart during that time. So let's take a look at that piece by piece. The first thing that we're going to start with is depolarization of the atria. Remember, we start at that SA node and we spread to the left atrium and through the right atrium, and eventually we're going to hit the AV node. And this is what's happening in the P wave. The next step, once we have our atria all the way contracted, we're at the flat stage of the graph. And remember, I said muscle contraction is always happening after the electrical activity. So in this flat part of the graph, this is where atria are going to contract. So any time you see a picture like this, where something is fully depolarized, like this one over here, depolarization is the message, is the action potential that's telling muscle cells to contract. So when we see full depolarization, we know some contraction is happening in a wave, in a direction, in the direction of the path of the electrical signal. So it goes down to the apex, and then the heart squeezes up towards the base. So atria fully contract at this stage. After that, and we know that they contracted because we see repolarization in the next stage, and you can't repolarize cells until you've already contracted. Repolarization is the reset to kind of get those sodium and potassium levels all back to normal after contraction so that we're ready for another wave of depolarization to occur. So we're repolarizing all of our atria, and the signal has gone from SA node to AV node to bundle branches. And so now we're going down the bundle branches of the interventricular septum and up the Purkinje fibers from apex towards base in the lateral walls of the ventricles. And this is all happening in the QRS complex, the big, tall, pointy thing. So mostly it's all about depolarization of the ventricles, but repolarization of the atria gets kind of hidden in that big, pointy electrical signal. So after we have depolarized our ventricles, we're going up here. And at this place, when we have our ventricles entirely depolarized, once again, we're in a flat part of the EKG graph, so we know some muscle contraction is going to happen there. So this is when the heart is in systole. It is contracting kind of in a spiral like this, up in that direction, from apex to base, squeezing every drop of blood from the bottom of the ventricle up towards the semilunar valves and the pulmonary valves, where it will eject and go into pulmonary and systemic circuit. So after that, after contraction has happened in the flat part, we're going to get repolarization of our ventricles. And so that's what's happening here. This red zone at the bottom is repolarization wave, and this is our nice typical T wave. Repolarizing our ventricles, getting everything set. They're after contraction. And then our last stage right here is our ventricles are entirely repolarizing. We're probably gonna, there's a moment like we're gonna kind of start to see our ventricles begin to depolarize, but we're just gonna go basically from here right back to the beginning again. So in ventricular repolarization, we have kind of another flat place in our graph, and it's just a calm place before the entire cycle starts again. All right, so your lab report just has you do some calculations with EKGs. And so on page 2, you're given kind of a normal EKG, and they're going to ask you to label a P, label the QRS, label the T wave in the strip, in that strip. And then you're going to be counting some squares to figure out basically the distance between things. And so, come on. You're going to be counting each little tiny square in between the distance of two things. And so the first thing they want you to measure is the number of squares between one QRS wave and the start of the next. So the beginning of a QRS wave, I've kind of started right there. And then you're going to count all the way over to the start of another QRS wave, and you're going to get a number. You can see I have some numbers here, and you're going to do some math. I draw your attention to a couple pieces of vocabulary. Bradycardic, tachycardic, I would know those, and know which one is greater than normal heartbeat and which one is less than normal. And then anytime you see a question, what does the QT interval, something about what does what does this represent in terms of electrical conduction? You're just going to put the electrical, the pathway in the QT from Q to T, what is happening. So it's QRS, right? And then to T. So what happens in the QRS? What happens in the T electrically? So what nodes is it going from and to? What branches, etc. That's what these kind of questions are asking you. So you're basically just restating information from the table you created on page 1. And so you're asked to kind of calculate some of those PR intervals or intervals on a number of different graphs. And so you're basically going to be learning to, in a way, practicing diagnosing problems or potential problems from the EKG that you're given. And so here in question number 8, you're given an EKG and you have to kind of decide, does it look normal? Does it look abnormal in any way? And so it has you calculate a PR value. And so you're going to pick on some level the beginning of P, and you're going to go all the way to R. And so I have done that with little red dots right there. I counted. And so you're going to count, you're going to figure out just the same kind of math you were doing on all the other questions. And then you're going to draw some inferences about the length of that PR interval and compare it to normal values that you saw in your book. Question 9 has another interesting EKG reading. And so it's going to, the instructions have you label 2 or 3 successive P, Q, R, S, and T waves. And so here I see the P, I see the Q, R, S, I see a T, right? But then I have this kind of other weird little thing right here. What is that? What is that? So I want you to think about that. And I want you to remember the question is giving you some information. Note that there can only be one T wave per cardiac cycle. So that this little red bump right there can't be a T. It's got to be something else. And so I want you to think about that. And so it's going to ask you, what do you notice about the number of P waves compared to the QRS complexes? How many QRS complexes are there for every P wave? And then you'll draw some inferences and answer the following questions. And so I'm not going to give it away, but I just want you to think about, remember that P waves indicate atrial depolarization, right? And then the QRS complexes indicate ventricular depolarization. And so I want you to think about how many times you see atrial depolarization versus how many times you see ventricular depolarization. And the numbers that you calculate are on some level going to help you answer this question. If there is an odd number of P waves to QRS waves, that's going to indicate a degree of heart block. And so heart block is a ratio of atrial depolarizations to ventricular depolarizations. And so how many atrial do you have? How many ventricular do you have? And then that's the kind of heart block that those numbers will indicate. And there's I'll go to a slide and give you a little more information. So on this slide, I just kind of summed up the three possible abnormal EKG, or the two possible abnormal EKGs you look at. So here's the one from page 3 or number 8, and then here's the one we just looked at, page 4, number 9. Please note these are artistic representations. I just drew them freehand, so they're not to scale. They're not for there's no squares or anything that you can count. This distance right here doesn't necessarily mean anything. And then at the bottom, I've also given you a normal EKG so that you can compare this EKG to the others and make some inferences about it. And then I've also included a chart from your book over here that might have some interesting information to help you understand what's going on in those possible in those possible EKGs. There's a couple of tricky questions in this lab, and the number 14 is one of them. And so number 14 asks you to think about if there was damage to the bundle branches on either the right or the left side, what might that look like in an EKG? So let's think about that. So here we have left, oh, sorry, I don't want that. Don't want that. I want my pen. There we go. Left bundle branches. So if my signal is going down my left bundle branch, fine, but the signal is somehow kind of statico or not really getting there that far, and by the time that this one gets all the way down here, this one is still way up here. How might that look on an EKG if we know that, you know, an EKG looks like that, right? And so we know that this piece right here is the ventricular depolarization, right? And so if everything is going at the same speed, we get this nice clear peak. But if things are not going at the same speed, I want you to think about what this peak would look like. What's going to be happening up at the top of this peak? So I just want to try to think about that and see if you can figure it out on your own. Email me if you have any questions about it. Then there's some questions that talk about cell processes. So I want you to think about the chemicals involved in action potentials, remember? So think of pumps and think of action potentials, right? So what ions participate in action potentials? Na and K, right? So think about that. Think about pumps. Think about energy molecules. If you are sending an action potential to some cells, what do those cells then need in order to turn on their active transport cell processes? So what do cells need for energy? I want you to think about that for these two questions. And then the last question shows you an EKG strip, and we can see that on some level something's going on right here. Typically we'd have a bump, we'd go QRS, and we'd have a T wave, right? But somehow this T wave is inverted. And so I want you to think about what would happen if your ventricles are unable to depolarize. If they can't depolarize, they can't contract. What's happening? And then think about what could happen to damage your heart in a way that you wouldn't get ventricular contraction, and let that help you think about a possible surgery. And that's pretty much the lab for the week. I've shown you all my slides. Thanks a lot. Email me if you have any questions. All right. See you next week.